The world, as we know it, is fiction. I guess you could say the Earth is populated with a colorful cast of characters whose storylines weave together the days of our lives as we pass the pen from one generation to the next. But as the plot thickens throughout the ages, mankind eventually reaches a point in time when he must ask himself, what's the narrative? Welcome to my lesson on Storycraft, where my focus will be to teach you how to structure a piece of fiction so that it is actually considered a complete story and not word salad or verbal diarrhea shat upon the page. Now, this isn't to say that an artist cannot stray outside of the given example that I will literally be illustrating in this video, but that every writer should at least have a basic understanding of what makes a piece of fiction an actual story before they decide to delve into more experimental streams of consciousness with the craft. I would also like to note that the method in which I'll be presenting this lesson in Storycraft is a reflection of my personal method of understanding structure and is meant to serve not only as evidence that I'm a writer that knows what he's talking about, but also to prove that I'm not just regurgitating someone else's presentation. More importantly, though, I created this video for those of you who may be interested in getting started as a creative writer. So if you're watching this video on YouTube or alternative media sites free of charge, then consider yourself ahead of the curve. I have high hopes for you. Now, for those of you who are hoping to dump some money on this educational webinar because perhaps you're just buried up to your eyeballs with an overabundance of disposable income spilling from the coffers at an alarming rate and burning a hole in your pocket, may I suggest making a pledge to live free, live rich? I respect the fact that individuals are making a personal decision when they do so, so as far as I'm concerned, you would just be another private donor making a conscientious choice to support a good cause, even if your reason for doing so has nothing to do with morals or ethics, and simply boils down to nothing more than because you need a write-off. Oy vey! I want you to feel rest assured that your name will be blessed all the same, and your eternal soul will be spared from judgment. Now let's get down to business. Let me get straight to the point. To put it simply, a complete story should answer 4 fundamental questions: who, what, where, and when. It's your job as the writer to provide the reader with some answers to these fundamental questions. So get out your notepad, pause the video when necessary, or just go ahead and download it if you want so you can reference at your leisure, because I'm about to deep dive into the nitty-gritty of story structure. Who? Who is the main character or characters? The main character is typically the protagonist of the story, the star of the show, if you will. But there can be more than one main character, which creates multiple storylines or threads. In this example, I'll illustrate a simple A-B storyline structure. But in a genre like fantasy, for instance, there could be several storylines sewn throughout the plot. Support characters are unlike main characters in the sense that they do not have the coveted star power. This isn't to say that they do not play an important role in the main character's storyline, quite the contrary, but the easiest way to tell if a character is the support or the main is through the writer's use of POV techniques, or if the characters are featured in their own scenes. The primary purpose of a support character is to play some integral role in the main character's development arc and/or the plot itself. But a support character may also have their own story and/or play a role in a subplot. Character development arc is simply another way of illustrating the progression of the main character's storyline or thread. This isn't always relevant in short story formats as much as it is in novellas and novels. Usually a main character will have some personal motivation tied into their involvement with the overarching plot, which is typically significant to the overall story in some way. This is where tropes come into play. A classic example is a protagonist that goes from zero to hero because they're the chosen one, but must first survive a perilous journey of self-actualization in order to fully accept that they are indeed destined for greatness. But will they find the courage within to fulfill their destiny before it's too late? What is the plot? There's no need to overcomplicate this. The plot is just the series of events that transpire throughout the story. That's it. However, it should be known that each event throughout the story should serve a purpose, which is to say, make a point, a plot point, that is. There are standard events that take place within most stories which mark key points which plot out a complete story. These events are typically organized into different parts or acts. The most common is the 3-act structure, with the 4 or more act structure being more uncommon. So I'll stick to 3 for this example and show how to write a definitive beginning, middle, and end. The purpose of the plot as a whole is to introduce conflict or some struggle for the main character to overcome, based upon what is at stake for the main character, or setting the stakes so that the character has no choice but to act. So essentially, there are 2 ways of going about plot and how that ties into character development, which determines whether a story is considered plot-driven or character-driven, and that's based on whether the conflict within the story is external or internal. The reason why I wanted to utilize an A-B storyline structure is so that I can illustrate both forms of conflict in one complete story. The primary goals for Act 1 is twofold. Introduce the main character and set the plot in motion. Typically, the plot is set in motion through a specific event that takes place in the beginning of the story, typically before the 15 to 20% mark, called the inciting incident. This is the reason for the main character to take action or become active within the story and do the thing with the stuff and go become or make it happen and go team. As you can see, in Bluehead's storyline on side A, his friends frantically make him aware that the sexy blonde that he's had a crush on for several years, but never had the balls to approach, has been taken hostage by a hostile mythological beast of epic proportion. So Bluehead is encouraged to go on a quest to save the damsel in distress from the clutches of an external threat that seems larger than life. Meanwhile, Redhead on side B, or the second POV/storyline, just finished the final book in an epic fantasy series that he'd been reading over and over for several years. Once finished, he suffers the same existential crisis he always has, and he must once again internalize the loneliness of a realm that's always seemed unfamiliar to him, aka the real world. Instead of starting all over again, which is what he would normally do, Redhead decides to make a bold move and chooses to put down the fantasy and step out into the real world to learn how to socialize, as he sets out on a personal mission to make a friend in real life. In Act 2, the story should present obstacles or revelations that challenge the character's motivations, which creates a climactic point in the story, a crossroads for the characters, a twist in the plot, and or a crescendo event, whether that's near the end of Act 2 or leading into Act 3. This may vary, but if you were to graph all your major plot points throughout the story and then connect the dots, it should look like a lopsided bell curve, with Act 1 events building up or setting up for the climax, which should be the highest plot point of the story. Bluehead must lay it all on the line to defeat the beast that now stands between him and his beloved. He stands courageous in the face of adversity and decides that he will make a leap of faith and will either succeed in his quest or die trying, because to turn back now would mean that he would never be able to face his friends again. Redhead, on the other hand, is having difficulty relating with others because he realizes that instead of finding a fellow redhead to befriend, he finds himself in a world inhabited by a bunch of stupid fucking blueheads. They all try to convince Redhead that he must be willing to risk life and livelihood to save some hoe he doesn't even know in order to prove himself worthy of the pack, thus prompting Redhead to then question his own motivations as he ponders, with friends like that, who needs enemies? After the climax, or turning point, we're now on the other side of the bridge, into Act 3, which serves to tie off any loose ends in the plot with the character threads as their storylines come to a conclusion after the conflict has been resolved or comes to a conclusion. Of course, this isn't always the case if we're referring to a series, which may have an overarching plot that spans several books, with each individual book within the series featuring a self-contained campaign or story within the broader story. So in conclusion, Bluehead successfully defeats the beast and saves the damsel in distress. What he discovers in the end is that she was not the fair-haired maiden of his heart's desire, but actually a soulless ginger who simply dyed her hair, and despite his valiant effort, would never love him, as she admits that her heart belongs to a man that could only exist in a work of fiction. Back in the real world, Redhead discovers that he wasn't actually lonely as much as he was just bored hearing the same old story again and again. So he decided to buy himself a new fantasy series that he could bury his nose in, and Redhead lived happily ever after, so long as he never again had to interact with those stupid fucking blueheads. The end. Where? Where is the setting? When I say setting, the first thing that I'd like you to consider is the aesthetics. And by aesthetics, I want you to imagine les costumes et les décors. For instance, let's say that instead of being captured by a mythological beast, the damsel was actually seduced by a reptilian, blood-sucking machine specifically designed and remote-controlled by a secret organization hell-bent on world domination. So, instead of slaying a beast, Bluehead must risk certain death by attempting to fly under the radar of said machine in an attempt to convince the damsel that she has been bamboozled and is being played for a fool. But little does he know that she had been aware of this the whole time, because as it turns out, his crush is a crazy bitch who just loves mind games. Yuck! Now, as you can see, aesthetics isn't everything. You need to have something going on in the background, and that is what the setting is for. Or else you will have what is called the white room syndrome, where it doesn't really matter what the costumes are or what the decor or the props are. The characters could be anywhere at any time period. They could just be at a Halloween party or actors on a stage, for all the reader is concerned. The setting should help the reader not only figure out that Redhead wanted a new game in order to forget about the social hellhole he was living in, but also come to the realization that the entire A-side storyline was taking place inside a virtual reality. The setting plays a big role in seamless storytelling, which is why there's more to the setting of a story than a writer's preference for a particular aesthetic. The setting has an influence over the style in which everything within the story takes shape, unless of course your story is meant to be absurd, but for the sake of staying consistent, the reader should be able to suspend disbelief because of the setting in which the story takes place. The ability for the reader to suspend disbelief, or maybe even become immersed in the story, will be based on your ability as the writer to build a world that works for the story. Think of world building as taking the characters off the set or stage with just a static backdrop and props and putting them on location. Developing the world around the main characters brings the environment to life and serves to not only breathe life into each scene throughout the story, like giving the characters something to do during scenes with heavy dialogue, or a means by which you can drop subtle clues or disseminate information to the reader without having to use a ton of dialogue, but also to sew together each plot point in such a way that the threads are seamless and do not feel forced or disjointed at any point within the story. I won't go into the details of world building, as that would pertain to specific creative techniques more so than structure, but world building in general is something that should be taken into consideration if you're outlining a story, or at least always remain on the back of your mind if you're a pantser. When? When does it take place? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. When does it take place is referring to the writing specifically, and whether the story is written in past or present tense, not to be confused with the time period in which the story may be taking place or took place, respectively. So that's basically all a writer needs to know in order to structure a complete story. However, I did say that I'd be doing a deep dive, so I've got one more question to explore. This last question is not one that's intended for the writer as much as it is for the reader, and that's why. If the writer wants to keep the reader thinking about a story well after they have finished reading it, then the writer must learn how to frame the narrative. The narrative captures what is at the heart of the story and or what the story is trying to say to the reader. There are 4 parts to narrative framework. Premise. When the reader starts asking why, they may be inclined to make an inference about this or that, which is to say that the reader theorizes upon that which is based specifically upon the ways in which certain information is presented to them throughout the story. The narrative premise, or thesis, is the subtext that's peppered throughout the story. This message is represented through the context of the story, which provides the reader with varying perspectives to ruminate or reflect upon. Unless, of course, we're either talking about a propaganda piece or a children's story, in which case there is no juxtaposition or nuance. The goal, however, of the story isn't necessarily to prove any particular theory set forth by the premise, because the story could offer counter-arguments, which is to say, provide evidence that forms the basis for the antithesis. When theories are left open to reader interpretation, the more likely the reader is to be in a state of wonder, and the more engaged the reader becomes, the stronger the narrative is in this regard. Tone. Another aspect of strengthening the narrative is to set the tone of the story. The tone of the story is the voice which delivers the narrative. It's the way in which the story is told that signals to the reader a particular mood. Is the narrator being serious, being ironic, or do they sound sarcastic, campy, cheesy, goofy, or facetious? The tone can have a strong influence over the way in which the reader receives the story. Writing techniques, such as using active voice, can strengthen the tone of a story's narrative. Atmosphere. Going hand in hand with tone is the story's atmosphere. The atmosphere is something that is sensed by the reader through the use of imagery in the narrative prose. Where tone actively sets the mood, the atmosphere passively creates a vibe. It's a means of evoking feelings from the reader. Atmosphere has to do with how the narrative makes the reader feel. Was the narrative light or heavy? Was it carefree or suffocating? Themes. Themes are a crucial ingredient in both literary and genre fiction in order for the reader to become invested in the narrative. If the reader can relate with a character or recognize familiar scenarios throughout the story, then the reader will be more apt to picture themselves in said situation or see themselves in a character's shoes, which will further serve to beg the question and strengthen the overall narrative. I hope you enjoyed my Master in Class Storycraft presentation on story structure, and I hope it has provided some clarity in regard to some fundamental aspects of storytelling. I'm Jonathan Rossignol, and if you ever feel like talking shop, one writer to another, then feel free to reach out to me on any of my social media. Cheers. Wait just a minute, we got one more thing to do. And if you've watched me before, you already know what this is all about. On your right, we got the Mythic deck. On your left, we got the Rebel deck. And if you've made it this far in the video, chances are you're probably a little bit rebellious. And if you can believe it, each and every single individual is capable of being just a little bit mythic in their own unique way. So, Kaloo Kalay, today's your lucky day, because I'm gonna draw not one, but two cards, I say. Can I get a hip hip hooray?